Welcome! So, you're using MongoDB, which means you're probably building something pretty awesome. But we need to talk about something that's absolutely critical: locking the doors. Today, we're going to dive into the fundamentals of MongoDB security, specifically authentication and authorization. All right, let's just get right to it. Your MongoDB instance is up and humming along. That's great. But have you stopped to ask yourself, is this thing actually secure? See, by default, a fresh MongoDB install doesn't enforce any security. It's basically an unlocked digital door. Anyone who can find it can just walk right in, look around, and, well, take whatever they want. We're going to fix that. So here's our game plan. First, we'll talk a little more about this unlocked digital door problem. Then we're going to tackle the two main pillars of security. First up, who are you? That's all about authentication. Then, what can you do? Which is authorization. After we get the concepts down, we'll get practical and walk through how you actually enable access control and start granting permissions with roles. You really got to wrap your head around this. When you first install MongoDB and fire it up, it's just open. It doesn't ask who's connecting, it doesn't check what they're trying to do, and that means anyone with network access to your database can connect, read your data, mess with it, or, just delete the whole thing. The default settings just aren't designed for a secure by default world. This brings us to our very first line of defense. The best way to think about it is like a keycard scanner at the front door of a secure building. Before you can even think about getting inside, you have to prove you belong there. And that, my friends, is authentication. To put it simply, authentication is just the process of verifying who you are. The system is basically asking, prove it, show me some ID. It's all about confirming that a user is who they say they are, before letting them take another step. Now, MongoDB has a few different ways to handle this ID check. The default, and by far the most common, is a method called SCRAM. That's just a fancy way of saying it uses a username and password. You can also get more advanced and use something like x.509 certificates, which is more of a key-based system. And if you're in a big corporate environment, the enterprise version of Mongo can even tie into your company's existing systems like ldap or kerberos. Okay, so your keycard worked. You're in the building. Awesome. But does that mean you can just roam free and open any door you see? Of course not. This next piece of the puzzle, figuring out which rooms you're allowed to enter and what you can do in them, is authorization. Exactly. Authorization, or as it's often called, access control, is what happens after you've been authenticated. At this point, the system knows who you are. Now it needs to know what you're allowed to do. Can you read some data? Can you write new data? Are you allowed to create other users? This is where we define the limits of your power. And this right here really nails the difference. Authentication asks, who are you? While authorization asks, okay, now what are you allowed to do? Think of it this way. Authentication is the key that gets you in the front door. Authorization determines which doors inside that key can actually open. One is about identity, the other is all about permissions. Okay, theory is great, but how do we actually, turn this stuff on? This is where we shift from just talking about concepts to actually doing the work. This is probably the most important practical step you can take to secure your database. Now, you really need to pay attention to this next part, because it's kind of like a chicken and egg problem, and it trips a lot of people up. You don't just flip a security on switch. Access control is only truly enforced after you create that very first admin user. You have to create the king of the castle before you can lock the gates. So here's how it's done, in 3 steps. First, you start your MongoDB server with a flag that says Enforce Access Control. Second, you connect to it. Now, because no users exist yet, it actually lets you in one last time. And third, while you're in, you create that first administrator, a super user, who can then create other users and assign permissions. Once that user is created, bam! The doors are locked. From that point on, everyone needs a key. Okay, so the admin user exists, security is officially on. So what's next? Well, you're gonna need to create other users for your applications, for your teammates, but you can't just give everyone the master key, right? So how do you give them just the right amount of permission? That's where roles come into play. And here is the core principle to remember. In MongoDB, you don't assign permissions one by one. Can you imagine how messy that would get? It would be a nightmare to manage. Instead, access is granted by assigning a user one or more roles. And a role is really just a convenient pre-packaged bundle of permissions. The good news is MongoDB gives you a ton of helpful built-in roles right out of the box. They kind of fall into a few main categories. You've got your basic database user roles, things like read or read-write, which are perfect for your applications. Then there are database admin roles for people who need to do things like manage indexes or other users, but only for one specific database. And finally, you have the super powerful cluster admin roles for managing the entire cluster, like adding new servers. You just pick the role that makes sense and assign it. So let's bring it all home. Security in MongoDB is not automatic. You have to turn it on. And it's a two-step dance. Authentication proves who you are, and authorization, using roles, decides what you can do. It's a really powerful and flexible system once you get the hang of it. So that brings us to our final question for you. Now that you know the basics, what's the very first security step you're going to take on your project? I really hope this explainer helped you get a much better handle on MongoDB security. If you found it useful, do me a favor and hit that like button. Maybe share it with a friend or a colleague, and definitely subscribe for more deep dives just like this one. Thanks so much for tuning in.